Welcome back to the War on Consciousness. My name is Aaron Abke, and I'm joined alongside my good friend and co-host Brennan Bozarth, alongside our resident researcher Justin Merkin again. And I'm really excited for today's conversation on episode 6, where we're going to be talking about debt slavery, the Federal Reserve, fiat currency, and all these topics interrelated. This conversation to me is honestly one of the biggest red pills I've ever swallowed personally, was learning about this, that we are really born as debt slaves, and our names are sort of stolen from us at birth. This is not something that I think 99% of Americans are aware of. And so today's episode is going to be helping you to become a little more aware of this truth. And typically, Brandon and I will begin each episode with our own kind of table setting of the spiritual parallels in the conversation. But we're actually not doing that with today's episode, because our guest today actually is already marvelous at doing that in terms of intertwining and teaching the spiritual parallels to common law. And, it's already something that Robert does so well. So I'm really excited to jump into this conversation today. So please help me welcome, I don't know how I should introduce you, man. American national, non-citizen, heir to the kingdom of heaven, Robert Michael.
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show,
We're
man.
all heirs. We're all heirs to the kingdom. Thank you for having me. And we should be taking that heirship and heiress position. We're nothing less, and that's really the key. I mean, people think that all these things out there have authority, but none of them really do. It's just an illusion,
Indeed it is. And we're going to get into that, man. So like I was telling you before we started, I've been really drawn to your work lately because this whole conversation we're about to have, like I said, it really was one of the biggest wake ups for me that I've had in a long time, in terms of like, here's kind of the harsh reality of how things really work versus the, like you said, the illusion of how we think or have been told things work in our country here in America. And so this topic is just endlessly fascinating to me for a number of reasons, especially because of all the spiritual parallels that really tie into this topic. In terms of knowing who you are as a divine being and standing in peace and love, being the only way to really exit this system that the shadow government's put in place. So, I've heard you say a lot of interesting things that started to wake me up to this reality, that one of which was, I think I heard you say once, we're essentially born onto a slave plantation. I was like, wow, that sounds really extreme, but you went on to explain what you meant, and it was just really fascinating to me. And so I know most people in this country would consider themselves free citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the reality is, until we know our real identity, our real rights, and this insane legal maze we've sort of been put into from birth, then we really aren't free at all yet. It's the illusion of freedom, as you talk about. So I want to set the table for this conversation by kind of tracing our history back of the Federal Reserve, and talking about why it was founded and how this sort of Ponzi scheme was first created back in 1911 through the meeting on Jekyll Island and all of that. So if you don't know anything about this yet, I would recommend you strap in your seatbelts, because what you're about to hear is going to sound probably a little bit crazy to you, or difficult to believe maybe, but I assure you everything we're about to say can be verified and researched and looked up as historical fact. So with that being said, Robert, let's jump into this. So there was a famous meeting in 1911 on Jekyll Island where a bunch of sort of elite banking families got together and said, hey, we see an opportunity here that we can capitalize on, take advantage of, whatever. Can you tell us who were those elite banking families that created the Federal Reserve, and why are they important for us to know about?
Well, I'm not the best historian with that. I'll say that right up front, as far as a lot of that particular detail on that story. But sure, I do believe it was the Rockefellers and, these other huge banking cartels that got together to form this national banking system. But where I come in with this, my understanding and knowing this, is that the reason they're doing that is because prior to this, Americans were very, very cautious about having a national bank, one that put all the money into the Fed the federal government's hands or into one bank owned by outside bankers. Really cautious about it, right? So they had to come up with this plan. So they met on this island, Jekyll Island, and they came up with a plan to create the Federal Reserve banking system, because they knew if they called it a Federal Reserve bank, that Americans would be, oh, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You're creating this, bank. So they called it a system. And that's where the fraud began, because their whole mission was to take over America and put us back in slavery after the slavery had ended and all that stuff. And they had been planning it, though. The thing is they had been planning that since the Declaration of Independence, believe it or not. This wasn't it just culminated in 1911 and then 1912. And what they did, because they wanted to make the government completely subservient to the bank, just like they did they've done this in every country. They bankrupt the country. So they create the Federal Reserve System, then they loan out the dollar bills to the government. The government says, okay, we're going to now give these dollar bills to our people. And the bank says, well, you're going to pay us however much percentage, on the interest on those dollar bills. Well, after 12, 13 years, they were bankrupt, because you know how compound interest works. If you keep paying it and the principal never goes down, then you wind up running out of your gold and silver, because that's the only real money to pay the debt. So they had the gold and silver to pay the debt. And then all of a sudden they don't have any money anymore. So guess what? Now they're broke. And that's when you have the stock market crash in 1933, when they put the Emergency Banking Relief Act in place. So this was all a plan, starting at Jekyll Island all the way through, and they implemented it flawlessly. And I mean, these guys, when they plan years and years and years. They don't care if they're alive when the plan comes to fruition. They just care that their successors are carrying it out. So this thought process that they have is beyond what our short attention span can even handle, right? Because everything's about us before we leave this earth. Well, no, they plan much bigger. And that's what we have to start doing. The same thing.
Yes.
That's not a bad thing. It's actually an amazing thing. And these guys are super, super intelligent. And the intelligence that has put the entire thing together is just brilliant. But essentially that's what happened. And I call that the third bankruptcy, because the first bankruptcy was basically when we had the Revolutionary War. So they had the Revolutionary War. They couldn't afford to pay France. So they wrote this thing called a constitution, which was a bankruptcy charter. Okay. It's all about banking. Everybody thinks the country was built on freedom and all. No, it was built on commerce. They tell you clearly the Articles of Confederation were not good enough because we couldn't tax anybody. There's no taxing authority. There's no commerce. We couldn't do commerce with the rest of the world. So the Constitution was all about business. It had nothing to do about protecting people's rights and freedoms. It was about business. So they created this business, or this organization, which is a management company, but it was broke, right? Because they had to pay these guys for these wars. So in Jewish banking law, every 70 years of bankruptcy is forgiven. For people, for human beings, it's every 7 years your bankruptcy is forgiven. But for countries, it's 70 years. So they were bankrupt, and they put the Constitution, started Congress 1789, 1790, right on the brink of 1790 there. 70 years later was 1860. So right when the bankruptcy was about to be forgiven and the debt was about to be forgiven, they created another war. And they went, oh, we got another war here, right? So that's second bankruptcy, bam. Then they go into the third one, 70 years after 1860. 1930, bankruptcy, stock market crash, right?
Oh, wow.
70 years after the stock market crash. What's 70 years from 1930? 2000. Well, they were 1 year late, but 2011 or 2001, 9/11. Okay, bam, stock market crash, or crash, the building and all that. So it was a bankruptcy. So they're reorganizing this bankruptcy constantly. They're keeping the country bankrupt, and people are none the wiser, because we're too busy, thinking we have freedom and enjoying all these luxuries that they provide us, that we just get caught in the muck and mire and never stop to look around and go, what's really going on here, right? So that's it in a nutshell, man, of how we got to here today. Really, it's all about banking and finance, and the Federal Reserve System are the ones that the United States owes their debt to. But the problem is that the United States doesn't have any energy, right? Because it's just an organization, and it doesn't have a body. It's not real. It doesn't live. There's no way for it to produce anything without people. So they can't produce any money on their own to pay the debt. So what they do is they pass that debt on to you and me, but they can't pass it on to you and me directly because it's not our debt. So they create an organization for us and they give it our name, and that organization goes out and does all the business. But the real thing is we're not debtors, we're creditors. We are the original creditors of the entire country, and we write money into existence with our signature. And that's the real thing that's the key for us to resolving this entire problem all around the world, because pretty much every government's in the same boat. They enslave their people through commercial mechanisms. They owe their debt to the bank. The bank then makes them pass it on to the people, and they enslave their people, make them commodities, and then that's what they use to get more loans from the bank. So they use us to get loans. Without us, they can't get any money to function. But then they turn around and tax you? Really? Then you're going to tax us? You know, you're out of your mind. You know,
they use us as collateral for their own debt.
Yes, totally. Yeah, they use us as collateral.
That's the big red pill, is like you and your existence as a U.S. citizen is being used as collateral for the U.S. government to pay off this never-ending debt they've agreed to have with the Federal Reserve, which I've heard, ironically, people say the Federal Reserve isn't federal. They have no reserves, and they're not even a system either. They make up their own rules.
None of those things. Yeah,
exactly.
To fine point on what Robert said, if you just really want to understand it in the most conceptually similar small level, when they passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1911, which they did in Congress on like a Friday night when there was a snowstorm near midnight, when no one was covering the DC, it is the ability for a private company to print money. The government can no longer print money.
Right.
That is really the most simple thing that people miss, is that at that point, it put us on par with all these other European countries that were run by central banks that they had pulled the same number on. So basically, you have a central bank system governing the world that they have the rights to, they as a private company have the rights to print money, and governments do not. That is like
that's crazy.
The basis of the entire slave system is based on that one particular principle. And in Jekyll Island, it was like J.P. Morgan, the Warburgs, people like this who were
Rockefellers, all that
stuff. Rothschilds, who all were meeting during that time. And if you look at who owns everything right now, it's the same people, and they just own more. And a lot of people, the people who were resistant, like the Astors and a couple other families that were resistant to the Federal Reserve System, conveniently died in the Titanic. So, like, it's well beyond conspiracy. This is just historical fact. I mean, there's like there's no historical facts not to support this narrative.
Right.
I mean, so it's overwhelming.
Was it the three members that were at the Jekyll Island meeting who opposed this whole Ponzi scheme? They all three just coincidentally happened to be on Titanic.
Yeah.
Which I guess 2 or 3 other of the members who were in favor of it were also scheduled to be on that cruise ship, and then they
canceled at the last minute.
And then whoops, it just happened to kill the only 3 people who opposed it. Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, how
there's some theorists that say it never even hit an iceberg, that it was shot with a missile.
Wouldn't surprise me at all.
From a torpedo. Right.
We have to rethink history once we learn this stuff.
Oh yeah, well, you know what this does? It opens your mind to the fact that anything is possible. Because 100%. If they can pull this off, they can pull anything off, right? So, and this is hundreds and hundreds of years old too. It's not like, but just in our recent history, from let's say the Declaration of Independence forward, it's all documented, so much easier to see. But these guys have been doing this stuff for millennia, which is where we get back into the Bible and all that stuff. Like, this is nothing new. They're just playing it out. It's just that humanity is finally waking up and saying, okay, we don't need to believe these other people anymore. We don't need to believe these narratives. We have enough information at our fingertips to use our discernment and create what we want to create.